And she said when the defendant wasn't arguing with her, he basically didn't speak to her at all. Their relationship in 1998, that fall, was just falling apart. And once again, as in 1990, 1991, Julie was contemplating divorce. Now, during this time period, there were a few people that Julie Jensen confided in. Particularly, you're going to hear these names a lot, particularly her neighbors, Margaret and Ted Voigt. Now, I call them Julie's neighbors, but you're going to see in the evidence that they were really more than neighbors. They were friends. They had lived next to each other for years. The Voigts also had 2 children who were growing up. They both spent a lot of time outside. The Voigts' children would come over to play in the pool. They would see Julie outside all the time, working on the garden. They would socialize with each other. They went out to dinners. They went to places like Six Flags with their kids. They went to the zoo or birthday parties, so they were friends. They were more than neighbors. In fact, you're going to hear in the evidence that Julie Jensen saw the Voigts so commonly that it was basically every day. Virtually every day they'd see each other and chat with each other. So one day, about 5 or 6 weeks before Julie died, in about late October of 1998, Ted Voigt saw Julie Jensen in the front of her house. There was a bench there, and she was sitting there and she was crying. And Ted Voigt was getting ready for work that morning, but he saw his friend, his neighbor, crying. And so he went over to her. And this is the first of a series of conversations that Julie Jensen had with Ted Voigt about her concerns about her marriage and what was going on with the defendant. You'll hear about these conversations in detail in the evidence, but basically over the course of these 5 or 6 weeks before her death, Julie Jensen told Ted Voigt about the arguments with the defendant, how the defendant seemed changed, her worry that maybe the defendant was having an affair, and things that Julie had noticed with the defendant about the computer. She talked about going by the computer and seeing sticky notes that he had written by the computer that were suspicious, that had weird words on them like syringe and names of drugs. And she saw the defendant on the computer. For instance, she'd be vacuuming in the hall outside, and she saw on the screen that he was looking up poisoning and then closed the door in her face. She described another time when the defendant had gone to work but left the computer on, and on the screen there was a website about poisoning. So now, moving to late November, I'm going to put up here a calendar that'll help you with the days. Moving to late November in the days before Julie's death, which happened on December 3rd, Julie confided in Therese DeFazio. And this was the last time she saw Therese DeFazio. And you'll hear Ms. DeFazio recount this conversation and how she saw that Julie was troubled and encouraged Julie to speak to her. And Julie told Ms. DeFazio that she was afraid that her husband was going to kill her. Now, Ms. DeFazio was shocked and she was taken aback, and she asked Julie why she would think something so serious. And Julie explained about that list, that weird sticky note. And then she explained that she feared that her husband might try to kill her with a drug overdose and make it look like a suicide. Again, Ms. DeFazio asked her why she thought her husband might do this, and Julie said there were other things that she couldn't explain. And Julie confided to Ms. DeFazio, the same as she had to Mr. Voigt, that it bothered her how every time she walked by that computer room and the defendant was in it, he would cover it or turn it off quickly so she couldn't see the screen. And then there's a third person, the defendant's sister, Laura Koster. During Julie's life, Julie and Laura Koster were good friends. So even though Laura Koster is the defendant's sister, Julie confided in her as a friend. Julie Jensen spoke to the defendant's sister about the same suspicious note, the one that listed the syringe on it, and she even told the defendant's sister. She told her in the fall of 1998 that she feared that the defendant might be planning to kill her.
Watch this. I can show you how to get the sweetest deals online when you shop from major retailers like Amazon and Target. You can drop
Now this sounds crazy, except for the fact that within a few weeks, within a few days of these conversations, Julie Jensen was dead. This sounds crazy. And that's the problem. That's the dilemma that Julie Jensen was facing. She knew it sounded crazy, and she explained it to Ted Voigt and to Therese DeFazio, that if she acted on these fears, if she did what a person who feared for their life would do, take her kids and run and hide, if she did those things, the defendant would point at her and call her crazy. Look at what my crazy wife did, running off with the kids, acting like I'm going to kill her. So here's what Ted Voigt said about Julie's dilemma. Ted Voigt said that her suspicions were that the defendant was trying to poison her, or he's trying to drive her nuts to take away the kids from her, because that's what the arguments that they used to have, that he was scaring her, that she was an unfit mother and he would take the kids away from her. Therese DeFazio said that Julie told her she stayed with her husband for the sake of the boys, whom she loved dearly, that she thought if she tried to leave her husband, he'd make up stories that she was unstable and that he'd get the kids. She didn't want to lose her boys. Another thing Julie had told Ms. DeFazio, going back to that prior counseling in 1990 and 1991, she had told Therese DeFazio during that counseling the defendant would always say things that were making her look like she was crazy. Remember, this is the man who for years tricked Julie into believing that her former lover was leaving debasing pornography all around when it was actually him. These days we have a word for this, we call it gaslighting. So let's be clear, this isn't a case where it's either a homicide or a tragic suicide. It's either a homicide or a suicide plus. A suicide plus an evil plan to frame an innocent man. That way the kids won't just lose their mom, they'll lose their dad too. There is one thing that is inescapably clear from the evidence. In spite of her fears that Julie expressed to multiple people before she died, Julie Jensen would not abandon her children. And so she stayed. Now, on Tuesday, December 1st, Julie Jensen went to see the family doctor, Dr. Borman. And during this visit, Julie told the doctor that she was miserable and depressed. So there it is, Julie Jensen talking about being depressed just days before her death. But she also told Dr. Borman that she and the defendant were having marital problems. She told him about the affair that she had and felt that the defendant never forgave her for. She told Dr. Borman that she's concerned her marriage might be over, and she told him several times that her kids meant everything to her. She denied being suicidal and talks about not wanting to lose her kids. And so we can see the parallels here to 1990. And Dr. Borman ends up referring her for counseling and giving her samples of Paxil, an antidepressant. One thing that you're going to hear in the evidence is before this visit to the doctor, the defendant was urging Julie to go see a doctor. So maybe he was just being a caring husband for his depressed wife. But this December 1st visit to the doctor was not enough for Mark Jensen, because the next day he went to Dr. Borman alone. This is December 2nd. And he didn't go for himself, he went for Julie. And he told Dr. Borman that he was concerned. He'd gotten some information off the internet about the side effects of Paxil, and he was concerned that Julie might be having side effects, and he was concerned because she wasn't sleeping. Now this was odd because Dr. Borman made no note about sleep disturbances the prior day, which is a common question, a question that gets asked all the time when dealing with depression. A symptom being sleep disturbance is a very common symptom. Without seeing Julie Jensen, without trying to call her or consult with her, Dr. Borman gave the defendant a prescription for Julie for Ambien, 10 Ambien sleeping pills. So this was sometime during the morning of December 2nd, 1998. By the time of Julie's death, a bit over 24 hours later, 3 of those pills were gone. And it's too bad that Dr. Borman didn't try to give Julie a call because something was wrong. The morning of December 2nd, when the defendant left the home, Julie called her friend Margaret Voigt. Now Margaret Voigt, just like Ted Voigt, was Julie's friend. But unlike her husband, Margaret didn't really want to be involved in these troubles. She heard about all of them through her husband, but she didn't really want to get involved. So she knew about them, but hadn't spoken as much to Julie as her husband had. So Julie talks on the phone with Margaret Voigt that morning, and Margaret Voigt, who knew her well, who knew her for years, said Julie's voice sounded shaky and it sounded like she was drunk. Now there's no reason for Margaret Voigt to know this, but ethylene glycol is an alcohol, And so one of the first stages of poisoning, the first stage of ethylene glycol poisoning, is a person will show signs of intoxication, like they're drunk. So Margaret asks Julie what's wrong, and Julie tells her, wow, this medication I took, I didn't know it would have such an effect on me. But Julie was happy because the defendant was now being so attentive to her. Julie said the defendant was being good to her. He took the kids to school and he's going to go to the doctor for her. And Margaret offered help. She asked Julie if she needed help, but Julie said no. The defendant was being good to her. Margaret Voigt never spoke to Julie Jensen again. Now these doctor visits are important because leading up to them, Julie Jensen had talked to Ted Voigt and described a strange experience where the defendant had very persistently tried to get her to drink some wine. And it just wasn't normal. These were people who had been together with each other for years. And the defendant didn't commonly offer Julie Jensen food and drink like that. She was the homemaker, that was her job. And so Julie described this unusual behavior from the defendant and how her not wanting to drink the wine had actually led to a huge fight between them. It was just another thing on the list of strange things that happened in the weeks before Julie's death. Now, the defendant had this ideal drug to enact his plan. Ethylene glycol has a sweet taste to it, and it's the kind of thing that won't be detected at autopsy. But he has to have a way to slip it to Julie, and being persistent and aggressive about it wasn't working. But now Julie's got this new medication, and he's taking care of her. And these effects from this ethylene glycol can be passed off as side effects of the new medication. And once Julie starts getting well and truly sick from this poison, the defendant now has Ambien to give her day and night to drug her senseless. And Julie did get truly sick. On Wednesday, December 2nd, she was supposed to go to Ms. DeFazio's class. She went there every Wednesday. She was very prompt. And so when Ms. DeFazio noted she was missing, Ms. DeFazio went to her son, David, who presented her with a note that said Julie couldn't come in because she was sick. Now, there are 3 stages of ethylene glycol poisoning. Someone who consumes enough ethylene glycol at once can die in stage 1. But if they reach stage 2, which is 12 to 24 hours after ingestion, the person's body becomes acidotic because the body breaks down the ethylene glycol into the poisons. And one of them is called oxalic acid. This causes breathing problems, heavy, rapid breathing, and it can cause heart arrhythmia. A person can go into a coma in this stage and die. If a person does make it to stage 3 of ethylene glycol poisoning, which can happen 24 to 72 hours after ingestion, that's the kidney phase. You will see at the autopsy crystals in someone's kidney when they reach this phase. So the doctors can tell these crystals are from that acid created by ethylene glycol poisoning, and they disrupt kidney function. A person who reaches stage 3 of ethylene glycol poisoning, they die a slow and a painful death. At approximately 4:30 p.m. on December 3rd of 1998, the police responded to the Jensen residence for a pulseless, non-breathing female. Julie Jensen was dead in her bed. The crystals in Julie Jensen's kidneys found after her autopsy show that she had reached stage 3 of ethylene glycol poisoning before she died. I don't think that there's going to be any dispute in the evidence that Julie Jensen was desperately ill leading up to her death. It's consistent with the medical evidence, and the defendant himself acknowledged it. He said she was breathing funny. She had a hard time breathing. She got up and she fell and she hit her head. The morning of her death, she could hardly sit up in bed. She was groggy, almost incoherent. Her breathing was labored and raspy. It sounded like her windpipe was being restricted. The defendant said, I'm not even sure she was coherent. The defendant also adamantly said that that morning she did not get out of bed. So now we go to the sleeping pills. The thing about sleeping pills is you're supposed to take them when you're supposed to be sleeping. And the defendant described Julie Jensen taking the first one Wednesday morning, right after he got them. And then another one Wednesday night. And then a third one Thursday morning, the morning of her death, when she was so terribly ill she was incoherent. defendant even describes how that morning, he talked about Julie Jensen, she couldn't even choke down water, and she didn't get the water because she didn't get out of bed. He had to get it for her. So Julie Jensen didn't take a sleeping pill the morning of December 3rd. She was given a sleeping pill. She couldn't get out of bed. The defendant gave it to her. And the children saw their mother dying too. David was upset. He didn't want to go to school. He noticed his mom's breathing problems. David said she couldn't talk that morning. And the defendant said something weird to the detective who was talking to him about that morning. He said, "There was a question between myself and the kids that morning about whether or not to call an ambulance, take her to the hospital."
I was down to talk to my doctor about Rybelsus.
Ask your healthcare provider about Rybelsus today.
The kids are 8 and 3. You don't consult with an 8-year-old and a 3-year-old about taking your wife who can't breathe to the hospital. And also, Dr. Borman, who had given her that prescription, given the defendant the Ambien, he had told the defendant, if your wife's condition worsens, you got to get her to the ER. But Mark Jensen didn't listen to Dr. Borman or his kids for that matter. What the defendant said he did was that afternoon, the afternoon of December 3rd, he said he went to work. So now we come to a witness by the name of Aaron Dillard. And before I talk about what Aaron Dillard has to say, I want to talk about who Aaron Dillard is. He became a witness because he was someone in 2007 who was in the same area of the jail as Mark Jensen. Aaron Dillard is a liar and he is a con man. Aaron Dillard is willing to provide information, testimony about Mark Jensen to help himself in the outcome of his criminal cases. So why call this lying con man as a witness, someone who everyone acknowledges is a liar? Well, what Aaron Dillard has to say is that while he was in jail with the defendant told him what happened about killing his wife. And now again, I cannot be more clear that Aaron Dillard is not an inherently believable witness. He's the opposite. But what Aaron Dillard had to say is eye-opening. Because the only people who know what happened in the last moments of Julie Jensen's life, well, it's only one person, the person who was there, the defendant. And up until this point, up until 2007, a lot of people had spent a lot of time thinking about this case, law enforcement and medical examiners. In this case, we're actually going to be calling 2 medical examiners as witnesses. You're going to hear from Dr. Chambliss, who actually did the autopsy on Julie Jensen, and Dr. Mainland, who studied the case and ethylene glycol poisoning. And there were some unexplained things about this case. For instance, how Julie Jensen was found in her bed. She was found face down in her pillow to such an extent that you're going to see that her nose was actually shifted to the side. A very odd position for someone to be in who couldn't breathe. Also, she was laying awkwardly across her arm, so her arm was kind of beneath her diagonally. An odd position for someone to put themselves in. It looks like someone had simply rolled her over from her back to her face. And part of what happens in an autopsy is that the doctors look for internal injuries. And there was some internal subcutaneous bruising on Julie's rib cage that aligned with how she was laying on her arm. And she also had some hemorrhages in the back of her neck area. Now, when someone's doing an autopsy, deciding that the manner of death is asphyxiation, that's often a decision that is based on excluding everything else. You have a person who's dead, and you can't say other ways that they died, but you see some signs of asphyxiation. So different maybe from strangulation, where there's actual force applied to someone's neck, but asphyxiation, where someone's breathing is stopped, like by forcing their face into a pillow, it's not going to leave the same signs. And so sometimes these signs can just be things that are seen, post-mortem artifacts that are seen, and they aren't signs of asphyxiation. But they are also consistent with someone who is suffocated. And so this leads us to what Aaron Dillard says the defendant told him. The defendant had a timing problem. He needed Julie Jensen to die on December 3rd before he got David from school. He could not bring his 8-year-old, who had already been wanting to take his mother to a doctor. He couldn't bring that 8-year-old back in the home where his mother was dying but not dead yet. So if Julie Jensen was alive by the time David Jensen was done with school, that was a problem for the defendant. And what Aaron Dillard said is that the defendant, he took the kids to school and to daycare, which is true. And the defendant returned home, but Julie Jensen was not dead. She was non-responsive, she was incoherent, but the defendant feared that she was actually breathing better. And so he first rolls her onto her face with her face in the pillow, and then he leaves the room, kind of hoping that that will do the job. But when the defendant returned to the room, Julie Jensen was still alive. And so he got on top of her, he pushed her face and her neck into a pillow, he sat on her back so she could not breathe, causing the pressure on her arm that she was laying on, causing the subcutaneous bruising, and then she died. That is the description that Aaron Dillard tells of what Mark Jensen told him. And there's other significant details that Aaron Dillard gives, details about the medications, getting the Paxil, how the defendant, his plan was to slip her antifreeze in juice when she's taking this medication. How Julie was acting drunk. The defendant apparently told Aaron Dillard that Julie was acting drunk. And then also getting the Ambien to sedate Julie. Now I want to be clear that Julie Jensen, untreated, and she was untreated, would have died of ethylene glycol poisoning. So it is that poisoning what this case is truly about. But the significance of Aaron Dillard is not that he is a truth teller, but he's also not a doctor, he's not a toxicologist, he's not a forensic pathologist or a detective, and he certainly can't speak to the dead. And the way Aaron Dillard was able to give details to explain some of the unexplained things in this case was eye-opening, even to people who had thought about the case for a long time. And not being a doctor or a medical examiner or a psychic, the only way Aaron Dillard could do that is if he heard it from the mouth of the defendant. But Aaron Dillard is not the only person the defendant talked to. You heard about Kelly Labonte being referred to as Mark Jensen's motive. Now it's time to get to Mark Jensen's mistake. And that person is Ed Klug. Ed Klug is Mark Jensen's mistake because on a drunken night, the defendant revealed to Ed Klug before Julie's murder that he was looking on the computer for ways to kill his wife. Mark Jensen knew Ed Klug because they both had moved to Stiefel Nicholas in 1998. Mark Jensen had joined the firm earlier, and he was actually involved in helping open Ed Klug's branch in Appleton. In fact, Kelly Labonte was there too. And so Mark Jensen actually wasn't so helpful in opening that branch, according to what Ed Klug saw. And so then they know each other from that, and they end up together at a big conference. You're going to hear about this conference that took place in St. Louis in early November of 1998, so before Julie's death, the big company conference. And Mark Jensen and Ed Klug, they know each other, but they both recently joined this company, so they don't know a bunch of people. And so they end up hanging out in the hotel, and at first they are with a bunch of people drinking, but then the hotel clears out. It's basically even past bar close time, and they've been drinking together and talking, and they engage in some wife bashing, so to speak. And so during this conversation, when Mark Jensen had been drinking, the defendant told Ed Klug that if you want to get rid of your wife, that you could go to websites that would tell you how to poison your wife, how to kill her, and it wouldn't be detectable. You could use things like Benadryl and antifreeze, things that couldn't be detected. And the way Ed Klug describes it is that Mark Jensen was telling him about a substance that would crystallize someone from the inside out, which is what ethylene glycol does. Ed Klug said Mark Jensen was telling him how he was doing this on the computer and how he was going to kill his wife. So Ed Klug is a big problem for the defendant in this case. And so I think you're likely to hear in the evidence a lot of efforts to attack Ed Klug. That maybe he's someone who just wants the limelight, just wants to insert himself into a big case. But what you're going to hear is that Ed Klug actually never came forward with this information to the police or prosecutors. We had to go to him because one of his coworkers suggested, you go talk to Ed Klug. He has some things to say about Mark Jensen. So not someone who's seeking the limelight. And also, I expect you'll hear, as a witness, from Joanne Klug. Because it might be said that, well, if Ed Klug didn't report this information right away, in fact, not until 2007, then how do we even know it actually happened? And this is where Joanne Klug comes in. Joanne is Ed's ex-wife now. They were married back in 1998, and actually until years later, but they're not married now. And their marriage was not in great shape in 1998, hence the wife bashing. So that night at the conference, Joanne was checking in on her husband. And that night, after this conversation happened, there's a variety of phone calls between Ed Klug and Joanne Klug. And Joanne Klug will come in here and tell you that that very night, Ed Klug told her, hey, remember Mark Jensen, my coworker Mark Jensen? He said he's looking for ways to kill his wife, including with antifreeze. So we know right after the fact that Ed Klug, in surprise and shock, told somebody about this conversation. He told his wife then, now his ex-wife. So when the defendant is contemplating this murder, after he was drinking with his guard down, the defendant told Ed Klug about this internet research on websites. And the computer evidence in this case tells you that's exactly what the defendant was doing. Remember that Jensen home computer I showed you the picture of? That was seized by the police and examined by experts from the Wisconsin Department of Justice. And you're going to hear a lot of evidence about this computer because of how important that is. But to try to boil it down for you, what you'll see in this computer evidence is the research into websites about poisoning, and then specifically ethylene glycol poisoning. Now that research was being done in 1998 in the infancy of the internet, and what's fascinating is that in this computer that was analyzed by the Department of Justice, you can sometimes even see what those websites look like in 1998. The computer saved that information. And there's no Googling even at that time. For a search engine, you're going to see Yahoo. And you can see this information. It was able to be recovered, even though the user of the computer, the defendant, deleted the internet history.
The gang leader, formerly known as A-Frame, continues to maintain his innocence despite insurmountable evidence against.
So nowadays, people live and work on computers every day. People are cognizant of privacy. There's things like private browsers and VPNs. But that back then, it was quite an unusual thing to delete the internet history. And that's what this user, this sophisticated user of the computer, did repeatedly. We're only able to see this internet history because of the analysis by the professionals. If a user were simply to open this computer, if it could still turn on even after 1998, and just try to look at the internet history, you wouldn't see anything. And I already told you about Julie's inability to use a computer, and the defendant was quite the opposite. You're going to hear from the defendant's co-worker, a man named Dave Naring, who was his friend from work. And he's going to tell you that during this time period, the defendant was very skilled at the computer. He was on the computer all the time at work. Remember, we don't see a single email from Julie Jensen. In contrast, we see a bunch of emails involving the defendant. We can also compare the internet history we see on this home computer with things that we know were going on in the defendant's life. For example, the defendant imagined going on a WISN12 cruise with his girlfriend, Kelly Labonte. The internet history shows a visit to the WISN12 cruise website. The defendant, in an email, he's offering to buy Kelly Labonte some clothes from Patagonia. On the home computer, we see that online shopping at Patagonia. The defendant is thinking about ways to kill his wife. We see those searches on the home computer. Initially, for a wider variety of ways to kill someone, like pipe bombs. There's even a website accessed with a story about a man trying to kill his wife, his ex-wife, with a pipe bomb. Or we see research on the Anarchist Cookbook, websites that have to do with like messing with the wiring of a pool to electrocute someone. Now that's the early research. And then we see the research for poisons. And finally, for ethylene glycol poisoning. And again, this aligns with the emails that we have between the defendant and his girlfriend, his future wife, Kelly Labonte. They start talking about the possibility of a future together, how they're going to deal with their significant others in October of 1998. And we start seeing this research on the computer about killing and poisoning. Now, interestingly, we don't see research about divorce or child custody or child support. We don't see internet activity that overlaps with Julie's interests, what was going on in her life. We don't see internet activity at all when the defendant isn't there. From the evidence, we know that the person doing this internet research, this hidden, deleted internet research, that's the person who killed Julie Jensen. And we know from the evidence that that person was not Julie. It was the defendant. Remember how desperately ill Julie was the morning of her death. She was incoherent, she was struggling to breathe, she did not get out of bed, she couldn't walk, she couldn't talk, she was on her third Ambien pill in about 24 hours. Her 8-year-old knew that she needed to go to the hospital. The defendant was there. As Julie lay dying, did he take her to the hospital or call 911 like his son wanted or like Dr. Borman told him? No, that's when he gave her the sleeping pill. And as Julie lay dying that morning of December 3rd, 1998, he went to the computer room, and that morning, he searched for ethylene glycol poisoning. You can see the search term on the bottom of the screen here. This is Julie Jensen. She didn't kill herself. She didn't frame her husband to make it look like a homicide. She didn't abandon her kids and try to take away their father too. She lived for her kids and she died because the defendant murdered her.
Thank you. We're going to take a short break before the